So, hi everybody. This is Color Theory for Miniature Painting, and my name is Henrik Ilvesmäki. Now, I've been in this hobby since 2001, but as my friends can attest to you, I don't get much painted. I'm an incredibly slow painter. However, my saving grace is that I'm an architect, and my background is in design and art history. So I have a passion for color, and especially color theory. I also teach at Aalto University, and I enjoy 3D modeling miniatures. So, this lecture is divided into 3 parts. First, we'll look at the basics of color theory, and after that, we'll be looking at how you can create color schemes that pop, that are very good for beginners, essentially what you need to know to paint your first miniatures. And after that, we'll finish off with the third section, focusing on primary color mixes that will be targeted towards more advanced painters. So, to start off with, we start in 1666, when Sir Isaac Newton targeted some natural light through a prism and managed to get out the full spectrum of color. Now, essentially, what color theory is this: the inception of color theory is this moment. So he basically took that full spectrum of color and then bent it around a circle in order to create the first color wheel. You can see the color wheel here on the bottom left, if you can see my cursor. And then what it is extended on the right side. Essentially, color theory discusses how color is described in terms of human perception and how it is categorized. Now, to look at the basics of color, the actual properties of color, according to color theory, you have 3 different parts. You have hue, so that is the dominant color family, essentially, what you would call color in colloquial terms. Then you have a value, which means how light or dark the color is, and then you have saturation, meaning how pure or intense the color is, or vice versa, how much gray is in that color. In canvas painting, you mostly talk about chroma, but in terms of miniature painting, the current trend is to simply talk about saturation, so we won't confuse things further with separating saturation and chroma during this lecture. So, you might have seen these before. These are the 3 primary color wheels. On the left, you have the traditional RYB color wheel. So here you have yellow at the top, you have red on the bottom right, and then you have blue on the bottom left. Basically, the idea is that if you take red and blue, you mix them together, you'll get violet. That's your secondary color. You can see that at the bottom. If you mix yellow and red, you'll get orange. And again, if you then go further and mix your secondary color and your primary color, you get your tertiary color. Now, in addition to that, we have the color circles, color wheels on the right. So you've got the RGB color wheel, which we won't be talking much about during this lecture. This has mostly to do with computer screens and actual light, how natural light creates how different colors of light create white light in an additive procedure. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, you will see the CMYK color wheel. Now, this is what we'll be talking especially about during the third part of the lecture. This is essentially what you use in print media, where if you combine the primary colors, yellow, cyan, and magenta, you'll get black. And the secret is actually that when you're mixing paint, you're using this color wheel, but you actually still often talk about the RYB color wheel. There's quite a bit of confusion there, but we'll go over that later. Now to the beginner portion of this lecture. So how do you create color schemes that look good on your models? The basics, essentially. What do we mean by pop? Usually if you go online, you can search for how to create color schemes that pop. That's become the colloquial term for it. The idea with popping is that the colors of the models and your models then are visible on a gaming table. You can see here in this picture that it's very easy to decipher which side is fighting which. You have the yellow warriors on the right and then the green warriors on the left. And behind them, there's terrain, which is brown. Now, when we talk about popping and why this is held in high regard in miniature painting, the reasoning is that you're trying to create visual separation. The human eye likes it when things are fairly simple and readable. In fact, that's one of the reasons, apparently, that the background reasons for why we even see color. We're able to decipher the separation between surfaces quite easily. In order to do this in miniature painting, you need to create quite a bit of contrast. There are different ways of creating contrast, and that's what we'll be looking at next. So the different types of contrast are, as you can already see from here, the properties of color, the three ones there. You've got hue, value, and saturation. But in addition to that, you also have temperature, so cool to warm, and then detail, which will cover as the fifth type of contrast. Now, when we talk about hue, the obvious main example is usually to talk about complementary colors. Complementary colors are basically selected by picking one color on the color wheel and then picking its opposite color. The three most typical ones are, as you can see here, violet and yellow, then you have green and red, and then you have blue and orange. In this example, the artist has picked the yellow and purple contrast, or yellow and violet contrast, to create this nice and harmonious piece. Now, in this example, the complementary color scheme is consisted of orange and blue. Now, the reason to use complementary colors in your color schemes usually is to try to create maximum contrast. Essentially, pairing a primary color and then its opposite secondary color will create the most amount of contrast that you can create in any given color wheel or color situation. And in this instance, you can see these miniatures are actually 8 or 10 millimeter high. They're really tiny. And then you have this slab of orange terrain under them. The artist has chosen to use a lot of contrast in order to then highlight the maximum amount of contrast. As the miniatures are really tiny, you should use more contrast to make them visible and easily readable. The other is also applicable, so if you have a larger miniature size, like a bust, for example, you can use less contrast and it'll still be readable. This has to do with the scale of the miniature. Now, as the third example, we've got green and violet here, or actually red, as you can see, but hold on. I just told you that its complementary colors are the ones opposite each other, but here we're using magenta actually here. So what's going on here? Well, this is a bit more like cooking and not exactly only science. So you can actually slant the complementary colors and it will still work. Now, it won't be the maximum amount of contrast you can create, but it'll still usually serve you quite well. Now then on to the next type of contrast, we have temperature. So here you can see that a tank has met its untimely end on a bed of, I guess, frozen water. And the artist has chosen to highlight the coldness of the water with these blue glazes, blue shades, and then instead have the tank be in these rusty, warm tones in order to drive up the contrast between these two elements. Thirdly, we'll have value here. Value is quite common. Usually you use this type of contrast with the others we've already mentioned. In this instance, the artist has decided to focus the viewer's attention on the focal point in the middle of the model, essentially highlighting that this humanoid creature is not in fact human, but artificial. So that's why all the other colors around are darker, and even the background is very dark, in order to drive your eye up to the lightest point. That's naturally where your eye will gravitate. Fourth, we have saturation, or chroma. And this essentially means, as I already mentioned, that you add gray to any given color and you dampen its intensity. Now, in this wonderful piece by Mike Blank, you can see Mike Blank, in fact, you can see that he's chosen to highlight the melee in the bottom part of the diorama with these very desaturated and gray tones. In fact, it's quite difficult to tell apart where each soldier begins and where they end. It becomes this mess of movement. It's a wonderful way of using desaturation. But then he's used very saturated colors on top in these two red knights to frame the white knight in between them, in order to, again, drive the viewer's eye to the focal point, which is here in the middle. And fifth, as the last type of contrast, detail. Whether something has more detail or less detail, or definition for that matter. This is not really used in miniature painting that much, especially not in 32mm miniatures, because they're quite tiny. This is not so easy to see, but you can use it in busts. However, the interesting part is that if you look at any artwork that you're bound to see, for example, here in this picture on the bottom left, you can see that the main character and where your eye is supposed to be drawn has a lot of detail to him, but then everything around him is actually very hazy or undetailed, and that's the way to then drive the viewer's eye. In this bust, however, Kirill Kaneev here, the artist behind this work, has chosen to instead render every material here, with a lot of detail, and then leave the face of the model, and especially the goggles, incredibly plain, again, in order to then draw your eye up to his face. This is very apparent in historical painting, because usually in historical painting you want to try and create the appropriate textures and colors that you would have for each material at any given historical period. So you don't really have access to as many of the other contrast types, especially maybe complementary colors, so you'll end up trying to use other ways to draw the eye to the focal point. Now, as I already mentioned, we use a lot of contrast in miniatures for readability because they're very small, but there's always purpose behind contrast. In fine art, for example, it's not so clear-cut. You don't necessarily want everything to be so strong in contrast. On the left side here, you can see Vincent van Gogh using red and green, the complementary color contrast, right next to each other and in a very flat tone to actually create too much contrast. I think you can see here that this painting has an unsettling atmosphere to it, and it's enhanced by this incredibly strong contrast. It doesn't feel very nice. So here you can see that you can actually have too much contrast. There are different applications where you would use something like this. For example, if you think about the flags of countries, they usually have a lot of contrast to them because the point is to make them visible. Another place where you use it is sports teams, because you want the people to be visible on the sports field for whatever game they're playing, and so forth. On the right here, though, you can see Vincent van Gogh again using a complementary color scheme. However, here this is peaceful and harmonious. Now, why is that? The reason is that there are different saturation levels and values all around the different colors, and that's how you can break up the planes of color in order to create something nice and harmonious. So, as I alluded to in this, we can't just use the contrast types willy-nilly. We can't simply just use maximum contrast. We also need something called color harmony. Now, there are 6 different types of color harmonies, which you can see here. But again, there's a caveat to these. You can't simply use these as they are. You need something called the 60-30-10 rule. In essence, you shouldn't have the same amount of each color on your model, because that will not look harmonious. You need to instead have a dominant color, a supporting color, and perhaps an accent color. Now, the 60-30-10 rule is very widely used in advertising and other graphic mediums, so we'll go over that next in terms of these different harmony types as it changes per the harmony type. We already talked about complementary color schemes, and that being the first one you see here, so we'll be jumping over that and moving on to split complementary. So again, this is not exact, an exact science, which means that in order to create still a complementary color scheme, you can actually pick the colors next to the one opposite. Now, again, as I alluded to before, this will mean that you won't get quite as much contrast, but here you'll instead probably have more harmony. In this regard, when you're using the 60-30-10 rule, for example, in this miniature, you can see that the violet parts have the dominant color, then the skin tones and yellows are perhaps the supporting color, and then the accent color are these blue and turquoise dots. The way to use this contrast is essentially to have 2 of these colors be more desaturated, for example, the skin tone here and the violet, and then have one popping color in terms of the accent color. And now moving on, we have the triadic color harmony. Here you can see the sort of exemplary model from Games Workshop's line, the Space Marine or the Ultramarine paint scheme here. It's a very common look, just picking the three primary colors of the RYB color wheel. You can see this, for example, in Superman, in Iron Man, in a lot of comics. This is a very typical, strong color scheme, and usually it's mainly targeted for good guys, usually in different mediums. But it's essentially very easy to use. Again, you just have one major dominant color, then a supporting color and an accent color, and you can basically do whatever you want with saturation. Now it gets a little bit more difficult with the tetradic color scheme. Here you can see that this is actually a rectangle on the color wheel, and if you look closely you can probably tell that this is basically two split complementary color schemes. So you can think about this as an extended complementary color scheme where you're pairing the two colors opposite with the two colors on their opposite side. What you need to do here usually is that, again, you have a dominant color and then the supporting colors are perhaps the ones on the opposite side, and then the same for the other side. So here you'd see the blue and the orange are perhaps the dominant and supporting colors, and then you have an accent color in the violet, and then with the highest peaks of the flames being yellow, you then conclude the final accent color. Fourth, we have the square. So previously I told you that there are 6 different color harmonies, but I perhaps lied a little bit, as there are actually 9. But in order to not spook you off, I didn't put 9 in the previous slides. The good thing though is that if you have the 6 color harmonies, you can then derive the 3 remaining ones from them. They're essentially applications of the previous ones. So you saw that this was tetradic, and now we just extend the square to have essentially more distance between each of these chosen color families, and here they're equidistant all from each other. Now, you would usually use a square color scheme because you have a lot of disparate colors that you somehow, or for some reason, need or want to put on your model. It's quite difficult then to have the model look cohesive. The way you usually do this is that you have a very large dominant color. For example, in Games Workshop's orcs, it's usually the skin in green, and then all the other colors are picked up as little points of accent color, essentially. So you have yellow, blue, and then a little bit of red here. Next up, we have a slightly more, again, difficult scheme. This is not used that much in especially beginner level painting, but the analogous color scheme is actually not that difficult to use once you understand what it does. Here you're picking 3 colors right next to each other on the color wheel, and the interesting part about this is that these colors actually have a value involved with them naturally, which means that yellow is pretty much always brighter than violet. And when you pick 3 colors right next to each other, that will mean that you'll essentially already have your shadow color, your base color, and your highlight color. And then that will create essentially your 60-30-10 rule. Here you can see this in this bust of Salah ad-Din, where the shadows are in this darker green, and then you have the main color being yellow and also the highlight color, and then you're adding a slight accent color with perhaps a fire that's burning next to him in this orange. So the analogous scheme is then extended with, namely, the extended analogous scheme. What's interesting about this is that instead of 3 colors next to each other, you're picking 5 colors next to each other. Now, this does something quite different than in the analogous scheme where you had the shadow, base, and highlight colors already coming from the color wheel. Here, you're able to travel from the cold side of the color wheel to the warm side. So you're able to naturally already create a temperature contrast. This is usually how it's used. Essentially, you get 2 at the same time. You get your contrast and you get your color harmony. In this Gene Stealer Patriarch from Games Workshop, you can see this used quite well. You have a lot of dominant color starting from the blue or cold spectrum, and then the supporting color picked from the colors next to it, and then on the opposite side or on the warm spectrum, you actually have the accent colors. You can see that the reddish oranges part are the ones which your eye is drawn to. And then, pretty much last but not least, we have the monochromatic color scheme. This is quite prevalent in nature, for example, in crustaceans. And actually, this painted carnifex on the picture here, the artist says that they got the idea to paint this from a crab that they saw at the seaside. This means essentially that you only pick one color family, but then you create the entire color scheme by essentially mixing different gray colors or black and white to the chosen color family. Which means that now you'd have a dominant color from one of these, and then you could then go either up or down, essentially from, depending on where you pick it. Do you pick it from a darker shade or a lighter shade? And then you can then switch up. So here you can have brown, and then you'll have black as the topmost color. Now, to conclude this section, we'll finish off by actually explaining how to use this in practice. Here you see an image of a space marine, and the idea is basically to tell you how you would paint this. So, going from what we learned before, we could choose a number of contrast types. For example, we can have value and we can have saturation on the bottom here. And what you essentially want to do is put the lightest colors, for example, the value contrast, on the head of the model, basically because that's where the human eye naturally gravitates towards with humanoid characters, in order to then not be in contradiction to your natural perception. So you want quite a bit of contrast to bring up the face, but then you can be more subdued in the legs to then drive up this hierarchy. So you'd essentially create a more grayish tone for the legs. Interestingly, then you'd pick a color harmony from one of the ones we just discussed before. So you could essentially have a split complementary scheme here, and then you could have a dominant color based from one of those. So you could have violet, and then you could have magenta as the supporting color, and then yellow as the sort of popping highlight color here. Now, I didn't really talk to you about neutral colors. I didn't talk to you about black or white. You can see that they're not actually featured on the color wheel because these are the colors that they're essentially most saturated. But what you can do with neutral colors is that you can basically use them however you want. You add enough gray color into any of these saturated colors, and it becomes so neutral that it doesn't actually contradict with any color harmonies or contrast that you're creating here based on your color wheel. So you can go crazy basically with grays and browns. But again, depending on your color scheme, so if you actually only have one saturated color, the grays and browns will carry more weight. Now, to finish off, we have the third part of the lecture. This is a bit more advanced. I basically just told you how to paint with hobby paints. I'm sure you've probably seen the different tubs of hobby paint. They usually come in a wide variety of different colors. But interestingly, if you show canvas painters our miniature hobby paint range, they will tell you, what are you doing? We don't use that. What canvas painters use is usually primary colors, different paints which actually usually have only one or perhaps two pigments in them, in order to then control the range of different pigments you have in the piece that you're doing. As you can refer from this, paint consists of pigments and then other mediums usually. The secret thing about pigments is that they essentially create the gamut of color that you're able to reach with a piece. The cool part about this is that even though this is going to be more of an advanced topic, it's actually quite easy to use when you're painting miniatures, for you'll be able to achieve a natural automatic color harmony by simply limiting the number of paint pigments you use in your miniature. Now, next up, we need to talk a little bit more about the color wheels, as I already alluded to before, in order to go deeper into this subject. So here on the left, top left, you can see a number of pigments arrayed on the color wheel, the colors that correspond to the different pigments. And as you can see, the pigments do not cover the entire color wheel at all, in fact. You can see that there's a lot more here on the right side in terms of red colors, and then a lot less here in the blue and green spectrum. Now, when Sir Isaac Newton came up with this, and then the generations of artists utilized the color wheel, they utilized the RYB color wheel, which was born from actually a bias in human perception, meaning that people are usually able to decipher more tones of red than they are tones of green. And you can see this on the RYB color wheel here on the top right. There's actually a lot more red here. You can see that from the distance between these essentially clock numbers. And then the colors packed on the left side in terms of blue and green are a lot tighter here. So essentially what this means is that the RYB color scheme is not accurate pretty much at all. It's usually accurate enough for our painting, but if you're actually mixing, it's good to know that you should be using the CMYK color wheel with the primary colors cyan, magenta, and yellow. In order to then use these well, you need to figure out also that, or remember, that these don't necessarily depict every color on the color wheel, as we don't actually have the mathematically perfect yellow, magenta, and cyan pigment in our range, or in any range currently. Usually what artists then do, if they want to reach every color on the color wheel, they need to have 6 primary colors. So then you have something called the Yermby color wheel here, which has yellow, red, magenta, blue, cyan, and green. Now, you don't necessarily need to worry about this. Usually the RYB color scheme will be plenty enough for you, but this is just so you know. Now, you've been looking at color wheels until now in 2D, but actually, again, there's a caveat, it's 3D. So, as I already discussed before, with the color scheme, the analogous color harmony, all of the different colors are tied to each other, or the properties of color are tied to each other. So you have the saturation, hue, and value tied to each other. You can see this here in this graph. So when you go up towards white, a higher value color, you have yellow here, and when you go down towards black, you have purple blue here. What this actually means is that if you want to reach the maximum saturation of any given color, for example, if you want to have maximum saturation in red, you can only do that from this gray tone, or this value level. The same applies for example, this violet blue here on the bottom. If you wanted to create a miniature that's really bright and mostly purple blue, you'd quickly realize when you're adding a lighter tone to it that it would desaturate. This is very important to remember. Usually when you're painting miniatures, you want quite a lot of saturation for the things that, well, you want to have pop off the gaming table. So you need to remember that there are constraints to the different saturation and value levels that you're painting with. In terms of then how you would use this and what benefit this gives you, if you're painting with just primary colors, essentially you pick a color close to cyan, magenta, or yellow, you can array them on your painting palette in this way. So you can imagine that on the bottom here you have blue. I don't know how well you can see it on the screen, but you could have blue or cyan here, then magenta on the bottom right, and then yellow up on top. And when you're mixing your secondary colors, you'd naturally see whether you're going a lighter or darker on the color wheel, whether the values grow or don't. And you can actually also use this to then create your paint shadow colors or your highlight colors. So here, if you have, for example, had red, you could mix a little bit of orange to your red, and then white. You'd be moving up on the color wheel, and then you'd have your highlight color. That's what the artist has done here. The opposite is also true. So you can have red here, and you can mix a little bit of black there, and then a little bit of magenta, and you'll have your shadow color. So again, this informs how you put your paints on your palette. Now, I just discussed with you about how you would have a maximum number of colors from the primary colors you want to have. So essentially, if you had the perfect yellow, magenta, and cyan, but usually you don't. And that's actually not a problem. In fact, that's probably a good thing when you're painting miniatures. Whenever you have your 3 primary colors, they're not able to create the entire spectrum of color, which means that you actually have this triangle on your color wheel. And based on that, you'll have your subjective primary and your subjective secondaries opposite that. What this type of painting is really good for is to actually create an atmosphere in your piece. This usually is used to simulate different colors of light and shadow that you'd have in the natural world. What's so nice about this is that human perception is so good at identifying or referring which color you're looking at, even if the color is completely different from what it actually depicts. So for example, you can see this blue shirt on the guy on the top right-hand corner here, and most of it is in fact yellow. But you're able to still very clearly read that this is probably blue. So the colors that you have here, what you see, are essentially malleable in your eye. The overall atmosphere impacts how you see each color and how you read each color from them. This is what's called essentially a limited palette. So whatever 3 primary colors you pick, you'll have this triangle on your color wheel that will inform your palette. The most famous limited palette is actually the Zorn palette from under Zorn, here depicted in his self-portrait. And what's so interesting about it is that it doesn't have anything in the blue spectrum. It only has black, white, and then yellow and red. Now you're wondering, okay, how do you paint with you just leave blue out? How do you create gold tones? But again, because of the magic of human perception, sometimes the really black colors in these Zorn palette paintings actually start to look a little bit gold and blue because of the colors around it, because everything is usually so warm around them. That's why the limited palette is so strong, because you can essentially not worry that much about the exact color you're using, but about how the color reads on your miniature or your painting. To conclude this third section, we can talk about how you would apply this. Now, there's quite a bit of theory here, perhaps, but it's actually not that difficult to use these. You can just have a set of 3 pure pigment paints, essentially containing only 1 pigment per paint, and then you can mix those as your primaries and create all the colors you're using in your painting based on those colors. That means that now you're able to then create the most contrast, again, using the knowledge from the second part of the lecture, by combining your subjective primary opposite it, for example, your subjective secondary. You can see this here. The artist has chosen to have the car in the middle of the piece pop out with its reddish tones, and then it's framed by all this complementary green around it. You can still use the knowledge that you have previously, but it's good to know that within this painting, this would be the maximum amount of contrast. Now, what happens then if you go beyond this? And actually, when you have miniatures with jarring colors, color schemes that don't work, there's something wrong with them, what that usually means is that you have a limited palette that you're just not aware of, and you pick some colors that are actually not on your triangle. When we're using hobby paints, we don't know what pigments are in them, so this may happen quite naturally. So, in order to then conclude the whole lecture, I'd say that this is, again, as I mentioned previously, more like cooking and not exactly just like science. So it's good to experiment, it's good to copy from other artists and not to worry quite all that much about it. But some knowledge helps. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions, if you have any. Please.
Thank you for very excellent pictures and very excellent presentation. Because you're so professional in this, I would like to ask you to take one of the pictures, like a scene, and then would you like to tell how your eye is moving, like inside the miniature? Because you said about contrast and focal point, but then you said that there is something interesting. So the eye is probably moving, and I would like to learn that.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, I think. You're able to tell usually in the miniatures, in the terms of 32 scale miniatures, that your eye isn't moving all that much. When you have a small miniature, for example, I think this is the best option, your eye is just drawn to the focal point. The smaller the miniature, then the less you have leeway here. This is a slightly larger miniature, so perhaps first I would look at the lightest point, and then my eye would be drawn to the head. Again, as I told you, with human perceptibility, you usually look at the head and maybe then the hands. That's why actually the head here is also light. You can see that there's a lot of highlight color on top, and then the hands are also lighter, but a lot less value is placed on the bottom. So in miniatures like this, you can tell that there's actually not that much to look at. There's not so much for the eye to bounce around. But you just have the blue, and then you have the contrasting terrain, and that's pretty much it. Any other questions?
When you're painting historical subjects, you can't just really select whatever colors you're supposed to use, the colors that are actually true to the source.
Yeah.
So how do you make interesting like a modern military figure that's basically all three?
Very good question. As I alluded to here, usually, as you said, you want to use the accurate colors for the time period. So you're not so much working with hue. Essentially, you can think that you can cut off the temperature contrast from your toolkit of different contrast types. So you wouldn't use the temperature contrast necessarily, and you wouldn't use the complementary color contrast. You would instead just be using value, saturation, and then detail. Now, in terms of that, actually, when you're using then a different color harmony, that means that you don't really need to worry so much about this. It'll be quite difficult to create clashing colors by just choosing different colors and not having them fit together. But it's a bit more difficult to create something that's interesting and, again, popping. So you have to be more careful. You have essentially less tools in your toolbox, but the benefit is that you probably won't create a jarring color scheme.
What about, is it even possible to have a readable and kind of a traditionally nice-looking miniature if you're trying to make a camouflage color scheme? Because then in the real world, the camouflage is trying to do the exactly opposite thing. So what can you do if you want to kind of have a miniature that looks like it has nice camouflage?
Fantastic question. Yeah, that's a big problem. You kind of can't. The cool part is if you, for example, try to take a 32mm miniature and then you paint a camouflage pattern on the miniature all over the miniature, you'll realize that it's not readable. So what painters usually do in miniature war games is that they pick one garment from the soldier, for example, and they put the camouflage scheme there, and then they use these different contrast types and color harmonies on the rest of the miniature. Then you can kind of fool your audience into saying that, oh, there is a camouflage scheme here, but you're still making the miniature interesting and sort of hierarchically easy to read. So I wouldn't just have full-on camouflage because the miniature won't be readable. I would instead pick the parts where you use camouflage. Now, this isn't actually a problem if you're painting in larger scale. That's why you don't run into these issues, for example, with tanks so much. It still impacts the readability, but there's a bit more leeway to still create highlights and shadows so you can have the miniature readable. Now, I think I could ask at this point from you, how was this for the beginners? Because you went quite far, and then did the advanced painters get something out of this? We're seeing thumbs. We're seeing thumbs. We're good. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Any other questions? We still have around 5 minutes. Oh, sorry.
Do you have any literature recommendations? You have the color and light here, but something else?
Yeah, color and light is very good actually. If you want to go deeper into pigments, for example, there's a YouTube channel called Mr. Pigment. The guy is a professional paint mixer and I guess a paint engineer in a paint company, and he goes over different types of pigments there. That's good. That's actually not literature, but it's I think a very good source for more advanced painters that are not obvious on online sources. In terms of other pieces, I think I would look, if you're more advanced and you actually want to read about this, I would look into some art history books, because usually if you, for example, find Zorn the Zorn palette, paintings done with this, you get more into the lingo and the logic behind what canvas painters do. So instead of just looking at miniature painting, which you have a lot of sources online from different manufacturers even, I would look into fine arts and then derive information from there and bring that to our miniature painting. The same could be said in historical painting. Maybe you look at some historical painting sources and you bring that knowledge to your 32mm miniature painting. I hope that answers your question. Is there a question there? No? No, okay. Sorry. There.
Is the recommendation now then to throw your hobby paints away and just size in your paints and make sure you are limiting your color scheme based on that?
Excellent question. I in fact tried this myself last year and came to the conclusion that, as you can imagine, if you've painted an army before, it's a huge chore to mix your colors every single time. So usually you see these more advanced techniques and limited palettes in dioramas, as it's a very good tool to create an atmosphere for a diorama. But if you're painting miniature soldiers, you usually just want a lot of contrast, and some of the jarring color choices don't necessarily matter so much because you have them all arrayed on the table. Now, it's still good to know what you're doing, but I would still use your hobby paints for that. However, bear in mind that you don't need as much hobby paints as the companies want to sell you. They want to sell you every single shade, and they usually use subpar pigments. If you buy a good set of primary colors from, for example, Golden or Chimera, you're able to then mix a lot of colors freely from higher quality, higher saturated paint, essentially, paint with better chroma to it. So the best idea is to actually use both. And if you know, for example, Roman Lapat, whose work was heavily featured here, for example, this piece, he uses both at the same time. So he will use a set of primaries that he's mixing from at the same time as using different hobby paints. The hobby paints are a good shortcut because you don't have to mix everything every single time.
I feel that if you read the theory and then you just go try some cyan and magenta paint from, for example, Vallejo, and you try this, then you kind of end up throwing your paints away anyway, just from your results.
Actually, there's a good caveat there. I don't know if this has happened to you. The paints are getting better in terms of the quality, but the problem with using hobby paints to essentially mix using them as primaries, is that they have a lot of separate pigments in them, and they have a lot of usually white and black for the paint to create more coverage on the miniature. And that means that when you mix them together, a good one, for example, is if you're mixing green from a blue and a yellow, it'll usually be very dull, very dull. That's the thing that you reach with hobby paints. They're usually pretty good in mixing with white or black or going up or down in saturation and value, but then you're trying to mix other colors, the multiple pigments there will kind of create a mess. There we go.
Yeah, relating to that, a small comment. Army Painter had their old paints, and they were, I think, more pure than the Fanatic range at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So the Fanatic range does, what's the word? Oh, no. What's the word? Cover, yes.
Yeah.
They do cover better, but that's because they are all gray.
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. That's the problem. They're not meant to be mixed. You should buy more of them. Now, before we finish, I need to tell you that right after this, we actually have a color mixing workshop coming up at 1. And then I'm also selling a sheet, because I won't be putting up this lecture slides anywhere, but I'm happy to sell an A4 and an A3 sheet, which goes over all these rules in a sort of handy, easy to remember set of info. I made this for myself because the whole origin of this lecture was in me trying to collate all the data I have into an easily sourceable place. So if you want one of those sheets, you can just contact me or stay after here. I'll give you some details about how you can get it and so on. I think we can finish. Yeah, I think we can finish. All right. Thanks so much, guys.